صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. The second one, for the love of Imam Hassan and Husayn, with the loudest of your voices. Allah sallam. The third, for the reappearance of our 12th Imam, Imam Sahib al-Asri wa Zaman, with the loudest of your voices. Allah sallam. Thank you all for joining us here tonight in commemorating the 20th day of Muharram. Insha'Allah, tonight Shaykh Murtaza will be speaking about who narrated and documented the tragedy of Karbala. Insha'Allah, let us all please welcome him with three of your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Trying to end by 8:30, right? Trying to end by 8:30? Okay. It's tight. Yes, please. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغ مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماءه العادون ولا يؤدي حقه المجتهدون ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد آل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. أما بعد، السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا بأبي عبد الله الحسين عليه السلام. We have completed 10 days of mourning for Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts all of our acts of grief and mourning for Imam Husayn. During this period of time, we have been inspired by the tragedy of Karbala. And we have been inspired by some of the actions that took place on the day of Ashura. And during this period of time, we had the opportunity to listen not only to the musibah, but we also had an opportunity to listen to the maqtal of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali. Just lower the volume on the mic. And sometimes that raises a question for us, especially when we are listening to some of the details about the tragedy of Karbala. And the question that it raises for us is, how do we have knowledge about such detail about the tragedy of Karbala? Who was there to describe for us what actually happened? For example, how a particular companion was martyred in Karbala. And particularly when we're listening to conversations, some of these conversations happened in public, but some of these conversations, they happened inside the tent. Some of these conversations, they happened inside the camp. Some of these conversations were between Imam Husayn and one of his companions. Some of the conversations were between, for example, Shimr and one of the companions of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. And the question is, how were these conversations reported and then narrated to us? So that's what we are going to look at today with another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Now, this discussion is going to become important to us for another reason as well. Sometimes when we hear certain narrations about the tragedy of Karbala, and we ask about the authenticity of those narrations, we are told that this has been narrated in other books of history. We are told that this has been narrated from chest to chest, from person to person. And don't be surprised if you don't find these narrations in some of the common books of history. So then this raises for us a second question. And the second question it raises for us is, so what were the original texts? What were the original books that actually preserved the narration of the tragedy of Karbala for us? Because whichever narration we have, it has to go back to the original texts, okay? Now you find that in the early history of Islam, the Quran encouraged Muslims not only to read, Allah says in the first verse, Iqra, but the Quran also encouraged Muslims to write. And by the turn of the 2nd century after Hijrah, Muslims had become prolific writers. And they wrote about a number of topics. They wrote about, for example, Ilm al-Kalam, theology. They wrote about books of hadith, and they compiled and wrote down the ahadith as well. But one of the areas that Muslims wrote about in a very prolific manner was history. And they wanted to preserve history. And this was very natural to them. You find that history was very important in Arabian culture. And they used to preserve their history in their oral traditions. In fact, they would take a lot of pride in preserving their history. So now they started to preserve this history in the written tradition. Okay? And you find there are different genres of history which are being produced in the 2nd century after Hijrah. For example, there were books of history that spoke about the history of one man, an important figure of history. For example, the books of Seerah, the Seerah of Ibn Ishaq, the Seerah of Ibn Hisham. They speak about the history of the life of the Holy Prophet. Certain books of history spoke about the history of a particular tribe or a particular people or a particular piece of land, what's happened throughout history in this piece of land. Some books of history looked at incidents of history. Today, if time permits, we're going to look in detail at Abu Mikhnaf. Abu Mikhnaf was a very prolific historian of the 2nd century. He has many books of history. One of them is the Kitab of Jamal. It means the history of the Battle of Jamal. One of them is the Kitab of Siffin. It means the history of the Battle of Siffin. And then there was a particular genre of history. This genre of history was known as maqtal. And the plural of maqtal is maqatil. Now, in Arabic, maqtal means the place where somebody has been killed, or the place in his body where he was killed. Okay? But today, when we speak about the books of maqtal, we mean those books that are describing a tragedy for us. Those books that are describing the killing or the martyrdom of a person for us. For example, Abu Mikhnaf himself, he has a maqtal known as the maqtal of Hujr ibn Adi. Hujr ibn Adi was a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam. But of course, in history, when you say the books of maqtal nowadays, they famously refer to the books that describe for us the tragedy of Karbala, the martyrdom of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. Now, here's the important point. Between the 2nd and the 4th century after Hijrah, 5 important books of maqtal were written. These are the original texts of maqtal. After the 4th century, there are many other books which are written. Some of them you are familiar with. For example, some of you may have heard about the maqtal of Sayyid ibn Tawus, Al-Luhuf fi Qatl al-Tufuf. Some of you may have heard that in Kitab al-Irshad, Shaykh al-Mufid has brought the maqtal of Imam Husayn. Some of you, for example, in the 20th century, you may have picked up Nafasul Mahmum, which was a maqtal which was written in the 20th century. All of these, they take from those 5 original texts of history. So what are these 5? The first one is the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf. Okay? And Abu Mikhnaf died in the year 157 after Hijrah. The second one, and I'm just going to read out the names for you. Okay? The second one is the maqtal of Muhammad ibn Sa'ad. Muhammad ibn Sa'ad died in the year 230 after Hijrah. The third one is the maqtal of Baladhuri. And Baladhuri dies in the year 279 after Hijrah. The fourth one is maqtal of Dainvari. Dainvari was an Iranian historian. He was more interested in writing about the history of Iran and writing about the history of Iraq. Now, when he writes about the history of Iraq, one of the most important incidents that happened in Iraq was the tragedy of Karbala. So he also brings that in his book of history. And the last one is the maqtal of Ahmad ibn A'tham al-Kufi. Now, of these 5 maqatil, the most important one is the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf, because it is the earliest one. Abu Mikhnaf would have started to compile this maqtal in the year maybe 120 after Hijrah, which is only 50 to 60 years after the tragedy of Karbala. And it's a very detailed maqtal as well. For those who read Farsi, today we have scholars who are experts in certain fields. We have scholars who are experts in fiqh. We have scholars who are experts in theology. So in Qom, we also have scholars who are experts in history. One of them is called Shaykh. One of them is Shaykh Rasul Ja'fariyan. Rasul Ja'fariyan. He's got a beautiful article called Khabaranigari Ashura, how the details of Ashura were reported and how they were narrated to us. So he describes all these 5 early and important texts of Maqtal. But the one we want to look at today is the Maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf. So who was Abu Mikhnaf? Abu Mikhnaf, it is said, was born in the year 80 after Hijrah. Some say he was born in the year 100 after Hijrah. So only 20 to 40 years after the tragedy of Karbala. He passes away in the year 157 after Hijrah. His grandfather was a Shia. In fact, his grandfather was a companion of the Holy Prophet and a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam. No, in fact, his grandfather in the Battle of Jamal, because Abu Mikhnaf, his name is Lut ibn Yahya al-Azadi. He comes from the tribe of Azd, okay? So his grandfather actually led the banner, was the commander of the tribe of Azd in the battle of Jamal in support of Amirul Mu'minin alayhi salam, not only in the battle of Jamal, but later in the battle of Siffin as well. So he was a Shia and he was a companion of Amirul Mu'minin. Abu Mikhnaf, is born in the year, as I said, 80 or 100 after Hijrah. And he becomes the most prolific historian of Iraq in the 2nd century. He writes over 20 to 30 books. These are all books of history. And he is one of the first people to compile and write down history. Okay? I mentioned some of those books to you as well. Well, we don't have access to any of those books anymore. The only one that we have access to is the Maqtal of Imam Husayn that has been compiled by Abu Mikhnaf. Now, there are 2 important points about Abu Mikhnaf. The first important point, and tonight I'm not going to go over it in detail, is that there is a debate about Abu Mikhnaf himself. Was he a Shia or was he not a Shia? Some from the Ahl Sunnah have said that he was a Shia, and therefore some of them reject all of his narrations. They reject all of his history. They say he is not a trustworthy narrator. What is interesting, though, is that some from the Shia have also said that no, actually Abu Mikhnaf himself was not a Shia. Now, this may seem to you like a very mundane point. It may seem to you it's not a very important point. But there is something very important for us to understand here. we have to have a little bit of insight into what's happening in the second year after Hijrah, in the first year after Hijrah. This is so important in understanding the growth of Shiaism. It's so important in understanding the role of the Imams in developing a unique identity for the Shia. Back then, there were many people who were political Shias, but they were not theological Shia. What does that mean? That means, on one hand, if you ask them, who is the right Khalif? They would say Imam Ali. Who is the right ruler? They would say Imam Husayn. If you ask them, do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has appointed them to be a leader, to be an Imam? They would say no. They would say they are the rightful Imam because they are the most knowledgeable people, they are the most just people, they are in the family of the Holy Prophet, but I don't believe that Allah has appointed them to be an Imam. So politically they were Shia, but theologically they were not considered to be Shia. Right? Abu Mikhnaf seems to fall into that category. Okay. The second point about Abu Mikhnaf is that unfortunately the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf was lost in history. We do not have a book that we can call the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf. You see, today when you print a book, you'll print 5,000 copies of it. The first edition will be 5,000 copies. Many people have a copy of that book. Back during that time, when somebody wrote a book, it might have 2 copies, it might have 3 copies, it might have 4 copies. Depending on whether it was of interest to people or it wasn't of interest to people, they would continue to copy it or they would not continue to copy it. You find that in history, many of the books were lost because libraries were burnt down. The library of Baghdad was burnt down. The library of Naishapur was burnt down. So the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf, unfortunately, was lost in history. The question then is, how do we have access to the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf? And we have access to the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf because there were 2 important historians that had that book in their hand, and they used that book verbatim almost to compile their own maqtal. The first one was Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, famously known as Tabari. Okay? Tabari has a voluminous book of history called Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, the history of the messengers of God, and after the messengers, the kings who came after them. So Tabari, when he comes to describe the 61st year after Hijrah, he goes into detail about the tragedy of Karbala. And Tabari generally takes from Abu Mikhnaf. In fact, we know that Tabari had a copy of Abu Mikhnaf in his hands. I remember when I was a student at UBC, and UBC has a translated copy of Tarikh of Tabari, okay? And I had picked up at that time in my second year the translation of that segment that talked about the 61st year after Hijrah. And it's very eye-opening. This is one of the earliest narrations of the tragedy of Karbala. This is a raw narration of the tragedy of Karbala. And there were some things in there that normally you may not hear from the pulpit. I remember reading about a conversation that one of the enemies had with Imam Husayn. And he was cursing Imam Husayn on the day of Ashura. So Imam also made a dua against him. Tabari is a Sunni historian, by the way. Tabari is not a Shia historian. So Tabari narrates that Imam made a dua from Abu Mikhnaf. Imam made a dua against him. And at that very moment, his horse actually, stood up and ran in the plains of Karbala. And this man, his leg got caught in the stirrup. So he got dragged in the plains of Karbala, hitting almost every rock and pebble on the plains of Karbala until this man died. And I remember one of our teachers had picked up the same copy that I had picked up, and in pencil he wrote next to it, "Miracle of Imam Hussein." And I recognized his handwriting as well. Okay, that is Tarikh of Tabari. The second historian who also heavily took from Abu Mikhnaf, and he had a copy of Abu Mikhnaf in his hands, was Shaykh al-Mufid. In Kitab al-Irshad, most of that narration comes from Abu Mikhnaf as well. Okay, So now the question is that Abu Mikhnaf, how did he compile the tragedy of Karbala? And who reported the tragedy of Karbala to him? And how did he go about collecting the details about the tragedy of Karbala? There's a very good book. Again, the book has not been translated into English. The book is in Arabic. It's called Waqi'atul Taf. In that book, the author, Shaykh Yusuf Gharawi, he's trying to reconstruct Abu Mikhnaf based on some of the texts which are available to us. So he actually categorizes and classifies the narrators of the tragedy of Karbala into 6 different categories and says there are 6 categories of people who have narrated the tragedy of Karbala for us. Now, his categorization is a very technically historical categorization. What I want to do today, and time is running out, is to categorize it into 4 categories. There were 4 groups of people that were present in Karbala, that survived the tragedy of Karbala, and that later transmitted what happened in the tragedy of Karbala. From these 4 categories, whatever we collect is what we have about the tragedy of Karbala. The first category of people are the soldiers in the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad. Okay? They survived the tragedy of Karbala. They were the closest to the battlefield. They were closest to some of the action. Some of them were responsible for killing the companions of Imam Husayn. And later on, they described what happened on the day of Ashura. In fact, Abu Mikhnaf, he directly spoke to 3 of the people who were present in Karbala, and indirectly spoke to 15 people who were present in Karbala. They narrated to somebody, Abu Mikhnaf took from them. Right? For example, we'll give you an example of this category. There is one of the, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Soldiers of Umar ibn Sa'ad by the name of Yahya ibn Hani ibn Urwa al-Muradi al-Madjahi. Okay. Survives the tragedy of Karbala, and he narrates for us the martyrdom of Nafi' bin Hilal al-Bajali. Okay. This name does not sound very familiar to us. Today, he may not be very familiar in the Shia community. Okay. But in the plains of Karbala, on the day of Ashura, he was known very well amongst the companions of Imam Husayn. In fact, we're told on the 7th day, when the water was cut off, on the very same day, Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he sent Al-Abbas, along with 30 horsemen and 20 water skins, to go and collect water from Furat. So this attack on the river of Furat on the 7th day of Muharram was led by 2 people. One was Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, and the second one was Nafi' bin Hilal al-Bajali. So he was one of the commanders. He was one of the leaders who went and attacked to get the water from the river of Furat. So his martyrdom is described for us by one of the soldiers of Umar ibn Sa'ad. Listen carefully to his martyrdom. Okay? He was so much in love with Abu Abdullah al-Husayn that he did not want to live even one more second after the death of Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. When he went to the battlefield, he killed 12 of the enemies. Abu Mikhnaf narrates this. He killed 12 of the enemies, and he injured many others. He continued to fight until both of his arms, Allahu Akbar, both of his arms were injured, and he was not able to use his arms anymore. So they took him as a prisoner, and they brought him to Umar ibn Sa'ad. So Umar ibn Sa'ad asks him, why did you do what you did? So Nafi' bin Hilal, he says, let me describe for you what I have done first. I have killed 12 of your soldiers. I have injured many others of your soldiers. That is what I have done. So when Shimr hears this, he says, let's kill this man. And Umar ibn Sa'ad says, if you want to kill, you kill him. So when Shimr is about to kill him, Nafi' bin Hilal, he says, praise belongs to Allah, who brought our death at the hands of the worst of God's creatures. and then he was martyred. So narrations like this come to us by the first category, which are the soldiers in the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad. The second category are the reporters of Karbala. And they were people who were sent to Karbala to be journalists, to be reporters. In particular, the person who stands out over here is a name that's familiar to some of us, a man by the name of Humayd ibn Muslim. Okay? Humayd ibn Muslim was sent as a reporter to Karbala. And his task was simply to report what is happening, to document it, to go back, and then to narrate what happened and transpired in the land of Karbala. Therefore, you find, on one hand, Humayd ibn Muslim is very close to the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad. In particular, he's very close to Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan. Many of the narrations about Shimr, the conversations that Shimr had, the actions that Shimr took, for example, many of the narrations that we have about the night after the day of Ashura, what happened in Sham-e Ghariba. For example, Shimr goes into the tent of Imam as-Sajjad, and there's a conversation that takes place over there. All of those narrations are narrated primarily by Humayd ibn Muslim. For example, he says, I went with Shimr, and we entered into the tent of Ali ibn al-Husayn. And Shimr asked him, who are you? And he said, I am Ali ibn al-Husayn. He said, we shall kill you. And then Humayd ibn Muslim says that I said to him, do you kill those who are young? Do you kill those who are sick? And I tried to dissuade him from killing Ali ibn al-Husayn. That narration comes from Humayd ibn Muslim. But because he was neutral in Karbala, you find that on the day of Ashura, he's able to come very close to the camp of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. And some of the narrations that you have heard, for example, on the afternoon of Ashura, one of the companions, Abu Thumama as-Sa'idi, he comes to Imam al-Husayn and says, it is time for Salat, and I'd like to say my prayer behind you before I'm martyred. Well, that narration also comes from Humayd ibn Muslim. Okay? And one of the interesting things about such people in Karbala is that after the tragedy of Karbala, they had a lot of regret and they had a lot of remorse. It's not only the people who participated in the killing of Imam Husayn. It's even those who stood and watched, those who could have done something, those who could have done more, those who didn't do enough. When they returned from the tragedy of Karbala, their conscience continuously kept biting at them. You know, it's interesting, we come across these moments in our lives where we have to sacrifice something, where we have to stand up for the truth, we have to stand up for justice, we have to stand up against oppression, right? And sometimes we choose not to do that. Sometimes we say, this is not my business. Sometimes we say, this does not pertain to me, right? The result of it is not only there is sometimes Jahannam in the Akhirah, but you find that for a lot of people, even their life becomes Jahannam for them. Right? They say about Humayd ibn Muslim that after he came back from the tragedy of Karbala, and even though he tried to do some things to help the camp of Imam Husayn on the day of Ashura, he was so guilt-ridden that he went and joined the Tawwabin. He tried to somehow make amends for what he did, right? It's very important for us to note that, right? We can't choose to be indifferent to what is happening around us, right? To what is happening in Palestine, to what is happening in Gaza, right? We can't choose to say, you know what, it's not going to make a difference. No, I have a duty. I have a responsibility. When you decide to boycott, that small act of not buying, that's your action, right? When you decide to protest, when you decide to share some information with your colleague, when you decide to take a stand, that's a very important thing that we are doing. In any case, the second category of people that we have are the reporters who are there in Karbala. The third category, and this is a very interesting category, are the companions of Imam Husayn who survived the tragedy of Karbala. There were some companions of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn who actually did survive the tragedy of Karbala. Some of them did not have to fight, so they survived. Some of them, they were injured and therefore they survived. Some of them, at the last moment of the battle, they escaped the land of Karbala. Now here I'm going to point out two people who are important. The first one that's important in this category is a man by the name of Aqaba ibn Sam'an. Aqaba ibn Sam'an. Who was Aqaba ibn Sam'an? Aqaba ibn Sam'an was a slave. He was the slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam Husayn, the mother of Sakina. Yeah? In fact, he was captured on the day of Ashura. He was taken to Umar ibn Sa'ad. Umar ibn Sa'ad says to him, Ma anta, what are you? He says, Ana abdun mamluk. I am a slave who is owned. I had to come here, so I came over here. Now, why is Aqaba ibn Sam'an important? Aqaba ibn Sam'an is important because he starts the journey with Imam Husayn. He is next to Imam Husayn. He is near the tent of Imam Husayn. From Medina to Mecca, from Mecca to near Kufa, from Kufa to Karbala, he is there. No word is said, but Aqaba ibn Sam'an is hearing what is happening in the camp of Imam Husayn. Now, something very quickly, because I have to move on, is that one of the things they tried to do after the tragedy of Karbala is many of the leaders tried to disassociate themselves from what happened in Karbala. Okay? For example, Yazid used to say, I had nothing to do with it. These were the actions of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad. These were the actions of Umar ibn Sa'ad. So one of the rumors that they spread is that on the night before the day of Ashura, this is true, Imam Hussein came in the middle of the battlefield. Umar ibn Sa'ad comes. They leave their armies behind. They meet one-to-one. Nobody can hear what they're talking about. And they have such a long conversation. Abu Mikhnaf says, much of the night went through into that conversation. Afterwards, people started to decide to conjure. What did they talk about? So one of the things they said, one of the things that they made up is that Aba Abdullah al-Husayn said to Umar ibn Sa'ad, if this is now the situation, then I am willing to give bay'ah to Yazid. And as long as you take me to Sham, we will go and sort out our differences in Sham with Yazid. Okay? But Umar ibn Sa'ad said, no, you have to give your bay'ah over here, otherwise I'm going to kill you. Therefore, the battle ensued. So one person who becomes important in history is Aqaba ibn Sam'an. He survives the tragedy. And Abu Mikhnaf quotes him, and he says, I was with Al-Husayn from the beginning to the end. There was not a single word that was said except I know about it or I have heard it. And he never, ever said something like that. All he said was, if you don't want me to enter Kufa, then allow me to go my way. I will not enter the city of Kufa, but not more than that. The second person that's important in this category is a man by the name of Al-Dhahhak al-Mashriqi al-Hamadani. Dhahhak was actually a soldier of Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. And he was in the heart of the army. You know, in the month of Muharram, I narrated for you a narration. I said, in the morning of Ashura, Shimr comes to the tent, near the tent of Abu Abdullah. There is a conversation that takes place. There is a back and forth that takes place. In that back and forth, next to Imam al-Husayn is Muslim ibn Awsaja. Muslim ibn Awsaja says to the Imam, Ala armihi, should I not shoot him with my arrow? And then Imam al-Husayn says to him, Muslim ibn Awsaja, no, I hate to be the one who begins this battle. And if you remember, we said that sacred goals require what? Sacred means, okay? Abu Abdullah al-Husayn used sacred means to achieve his goals, right? Now you may wonder to yourself, that's a conversation that took place between two people, both of whom were martyred in Karbala. Who narrates this conversation? Al-Dhahhak narrates this conversation. But the narration of how he escaped, and we'll have to end with that, it really shows you the heart and the spirit of Abu Abdullah al-Husayn. He was a man of great spirit. At every moment, the truth was clear for him. At no moment did he lose context at all. You know, Dhahhak says in the middle of the battle, I was fighting in front of Al-Husayn, and he could see me fighting. And as I was fighting the enemy, sometimes I would just chop off their limbs. I would chop off their arms. I would chop off their legs. By the way, not only Abu Mikhnaf narrates this, but also Shaykh Abbas Qummi also has seen it fit to narrate this. So Al-Husayn said to me, don't do that. For the Prophet did not like someone to mutilate people. You are going to kill them, but do not mutilate them. Okay? He said, so I continued to fight in front of him until I realized there were no companions left with him. All of his companions had been martyred. All of his family had been martyred. And now the only person, the lone rider in Karbala, was Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. I turned to him and said, oh Husayn, do you remember our agreement that we made last night? You know, the night where Imam Husayn turned off all the lights and said, you're free to go? Dhahak made an agreement with the Imam. He said, I fight for you. My sword fights for you as long as you have helpers and companions. But the moment all of your companions have been martyred, I am free to leave Karbala. Didn't you agree to that? Like, subhanallah, what a time to come to Imam Husayn. He can see his family behind him. He can see his children behind him. He is calling out, Amam min Nasirin yansuruna. But this man comes to the Imam and says, we made an agreement. The Imam said, indeed, we made an agreement. You are free to go. But the Imam says to him, you are going to leave Karbala. Tell me, how are you going to escape? And the Haq said, I have hidden a horse. That horse will allow me to escape. He did escape the plains of Karbala. And then he is the one who narrates some of what happened inside the army of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn, the sentiments inside the army of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn, the mood and the atmosphere inside the army was narrated by Dhahak. The last category, and I won't go into detail in this category. So the first category were the soldiers. The second category were the reporters. The third category, the companions of Aba Abdullah. And the fourth category were the family of the companions and the family of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. Abu Mikhnaf actually met the wife of Zuhair ibn Qayn. He met Dulham, the wife of Zuhair. She directly narrated for him the meeting between Imam Husayn and Zuhair. That's how we have information about that meeting. He also narrates from Imam al-Sajjad, not directly, indirectly, Imam al-Baqir, Imam al-Sadiq, Zayd, the son of Imam al-Sajjad, and some other members of the family about some of the details that happened in Karbala. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. يا أبا عبد الله يا حسين بن علي أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع. One more time. يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا. On the day of Ashura, the body of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn was left on the plains of Karbala. But the head of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn was taken to the city of Kufa. And later it was paraded in the city of Kufa, paraded in the city of Sham, paraded on top of a spear. Abu Mikhnaf narrates that Khuli was the one who took the head of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn on the afternoon of Ashura from Karbala to the city of Kufa. When he reached the city of Kufa, it was late in the night. And he took the head of Aba Abdullah al-Husayn to his home. When he came to his home, he said to his wife, I have brought for you the head of al-Husayn, the head of the son of Fatima. She said to him, "What kind of a man are you? People bring gold and silver for their family, and you bring for your family the head of the son of Fatima, the head of the grandson of Rasulullah." She narrates, "That night I went and found the head of Al-Husayn, and he had kept it at a very peculiar place in the house. When I picked up the head of Al-Husayn, I saw with my eyes light that went from his head all the way to the heavens. And I saw birds circling around that light. That was the head of Al-Husayn." But how did they treat the head of Aba Abdullah? Can you imagine when the women and children would see the head of Al-Husayn? Or when they would take the head of Al-Husayn into the court of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, and they placed it on a tray. And Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, he takes a stick and he starts striking at the lips and the teeth of Aba Abdullah. One of the Sahaba, one of the companions of the Holy Prophet who was present in that gathering, he said to Ubaidullah, "Remove your stick from the lips of Al-Husayn, for I have seen the Prophet of Allah kissing the lips of Al-Husayn." But they took this head on top of the spear. What a great calamity it was that even when the caravan comes back to the city of Medina and Bashir goes to announce the return of the caravan to the city of Medina, he calls out, "Ya ahla Yathrib." He says to them, "O people of Medina, this is not a place for you to live. قتل الحسين فدمعي مدرارا." Al-Husayn has been martyred, and the tears are flowing from my eyes. الجسم منه بكربلاء مدرج. His body was lying on the plains of Karbala. وَالرَّأَسُ مِنْهُ عَلَى الْقَنَاةِ يُدَارُ. And with his head, they put it on top of a spear, and they took it from city to city and from land to land. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا آلَ مُحَمَّدٍ أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. O Allah, we ask you to accept our azah for Aba Abdullah al-Husayn. O Allah, we ask you to accept all of our good deeds and to forgive all of our sins. O Allah, we ask you for those who are sick. O Allah, grant them a complete and a quick recovery. O Allah, we ask you for our marhumin to shower them with your rahmah and your maghfirah. And O Allah, in particular, we ask you tonight for the shuhada of Islam, the shuhada of Palestine, and for marhum Sayyid Hassan Imran Naqvi, son of Sayyid Shabihul Hassan Naqvi, for marhuma Zainab Ja'far, for marhuma Kawsar Haidar Ali Vakil, and for all of our marhumin to shower them with your rahmah and your maghfirah, and give them a place and a daraja in the vicinity of the shuhada of Karbala. O Allah, we ask you to hasten the reappearance of the 12th Imam and make us amongst the a'wan and the helpers of the 12th Imam. Ya Husayn.
Ya Husayn. या हुसैन ऊंचा रहे अपना आलम ऊंचा रहे अपना आलम ऊंचा रहे अपना आलम रहे अपना आलम ऊंचा ऊंचा रहे अपना जब तक है दौरे आसमां जब तक है दौरे आसमां सुन ले ये हर पीरो जवां सुन ले ये हर आवाज पर शब्बीर की बरता रहे ये کارواں رکنے نہ پائے، یہ قدم اونچا رہے اپنا علم اونچا رہے، ہر قلب پر چھاتے چلو، ہر قلب پر چھاتے چلو، دنیا کو بھتلاتے چلو، دنیا کو بھتلاتے، ایک ایک محاذر ظلم کی تصویر دکھلاتے چلو، ہر دل میں بھر دو شہ کا غم اونچا رہے اونچا رہے، کب تک نہ مانے گا کوئی، نہ مانے گا کوئی، وہ وقت آئے گا کبھی، وہ وقت آئے گا، ہر قلب پر چھا جائے گا اپنا حسین ابن علی، اس در پہ ہر سر ہوگا خم، اونچا رہے اپنا اونچا، جب بھی کوئی مشکل پڑی، جب بھی کوئی مشکل پڑی، دنیا اسی در پر جھکی، دنیا اسی در، سینوں سے بل کھا کر ادھر اٹھتی صدائے یا علی، نکلاؤ دربا دل قدم اونچا رہے اونچا، یہ پرچم عباس ہے، یہ پرچم ٹوٹے دلوں کی آس ہے، دلوں کی آس ہے، اب تک اسی پرچم تھلے زندہ کسی کی پیاس ہے، جس نے سہیلا کھو ستم، اونچا رہے اپنا اونچا، عباس ہے نام وفا، عباس ہے نام، آغاز و انجام وفا، آغاز و منہ مور کے دریا سے جو پیتا رہا جام وفا، ہوتے رہے بازو قلم اونچا اونچا، وہ تیر بانی جفا، وہ تیر بانی، مظلوم کا ننھا گلا، مظلوم کا ننھا گلا، اسلام زندہ کر گئی اصغر کی مرنے کی ادا، ہنس کر سہاتی رے ستم، اونچا اونچا رہے اپنا علم، اونچا رہے اپنا علم اونچا، بر محمد وآل محمد صلوات۔
أزور سيدي ومولاي ومعتمدي ورجاي، ذخري وذخيرتي في آخرتي ودنياي، سيدي ومولاي أبا عبد الله الحسين، نيابة عن مولاي صاحب العصر والزمان، قربة طاعة إلى الله تعالى. السلام عليك يا وارث آدم صفوة الله. السلام عليك يا وارث نوح النبي الله. السلام عليك يا وارث إبراهيم خليل الله. السلام عليك يا وارث موسى كليم الله. السلام عليك يا وارث عيسى روح الله. السلام عليك يا وارث محمد حبيب الله. السلام عليك يا وارث أمير المؤمنين عليه السلام ولي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن محمد المصطفى. السلام عليك يا ابن علي المرتضى. السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء. السلام عليك يا ابن خديجة الكبرى. السلام عليك يا ثار الله وابن ثاره والوتر الموتور. أشهد أنك قد أقمت الصلاة وآتيت الزكاة وأمرت بالمعروف ونهيت عن المنكر وأطعت الله ورسوله حتى أتاك اليقين. فلعن الله أمة قتلت ولعن الله أمة ظلمت ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به. يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، أشهد أنك كنت نورا في الأصلاب الشامخة والأرحام المطهرة، لم تنجسك الجاهلية بأنجاسها ولم تلبسك من مدلمات ثيابها. وأشهد أنك من دائم الدين وأركان المؤمنين. وأشهد أنك الإمام البر التقي الرضي الزكي الهادي المهدي. وأشهد أن الأئمة من ولدك كلمة التقوى وآلام الهدى والعروة الوثقى والحجة على أهل الدنيا. أشهد الله وملائكته وأنبياءه ورسله أني بكم مؤمن وبيابكم موقن بشرائع ديني وخواتيم عملي وقلبي لقلبكم سين وأمري لأمركم متبع. صلوات الله عليكم وعلى أرواحكم وعلى أجسادكم وعلى أجسامكم وعلى شاهدكم وعلى غائبكم وعلى ظاهركم وعلى باطنكم. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم altogether. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام على 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين: علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. الصلاة والسلام عليك سيدي ومولاي يا صاحب العصر والزمان وخليفة الرحمن وإمام الإنس والجان. عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله تعالى مخرجه وظهوره. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعوا فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Inshallah, we are going to be serving dinner in the gym. If you could all head towards the gym, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad.